All right, so welcome everybody to CHCDIV002. We'll just do an acknowledgement of country here before we begin. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Haida Institute acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of this nation and the traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live and study. We express our gratitude for the sharing of this land, our sorrow for the personal, spiritual and cultural costs of that sharing, and hope that we may move forward together in harmony and in the spirit of healing. We pay our respects to all First Nations people and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Just as a reminder, our housekeeping that we do each week, cameras on please and your mics off whilst I'm presenting. And if you've got a burning question, your hand emoji down the bottom in reactions is there for you to use. We also remember that we have respectful relationships here around good communication, nice and clear, kind words, attentive listening and participation. It's really good that you can participate as well. Lots of rich learning comes out of that from everybody's experiences. No smoking or vaping on screen, please. Adult learning, just turn your screen off if that's what you need to do. And also some of the content can actually create adverse reactions for you. So I'm going to give you a link to some numbers for that as well, because it's about your self-care and how you're managing your own health, and make sure you have time out each week for yourself to rejuvenate. And just a reminder here around your duty of care here, your respectful language and leaving our biases aside is our duty of care. We don't need to leave our own opinions and thoughts. We don't have to lose those. But when we're working with people in the industry, we sit them to the side and we work with people where they are in their space. This is a list of numbers if you ever had an adverse reaction, but they're also good for you to start building up your resources for when you are working out in the industry as well. So 13 Yarn for our First Nations peoples, Lifeline, Beyond Blue. Now, don't forget, Lifeline is actually something that we're supporting our learners to call when you feel a stress and anxiety and being overwhelmed. Lifeline are great to talk to around that study stress or just life stresses. It doesn't have to be dire situations. It's anything that's adversely affecting you. They're great people to talk to. We have the mental health line in New South Wales, and you can also use a Beyond Blue app and just use texting if you want, if you don't want to actually speak to anyone. But it's about regulating yourself to understand how you manage your behavior and reactions and feelings to things that are happening around you. And when we're working in this industry, often we come up to scenarios or working with people that might remind of us something that we might have been through, and it can cause a little bit of anxiety or feelings come up for you. Make sure you're reaching out and have your own practices in place here too. It's not just about duty of care for our participants that we're working with, it's our duty of care to ourselves as well. So we've got a lot to get through tonight, especially around the diversity of First Nations peoples in Australia and our historical colonisation that's happened, and some of the negative effects of that's actually still affecting people's mental health today. So we've got quite a few things to look at. So we're going to start off with an activity, and I use this website called Creative Spirits. Great website with information. I'm going to pop that into the chat box there for everyone. It's also up here on the screen for those learners who are at home. You can access that. So what we're going to do, we're going to go off into groups and we're going to do a bit of research around what information exists prior to the invasion and then what has happened when that happened and then the effects further on down the line. So we're going to be looking at the following things. We're looking at the data on the nations across Australia before invasion. So we're looking at some of the numbers, some of the languages used. Another group is going to be looking at Aboriginal slavery and what happened in Australia in the First Nations peoples during that time. Another group will be looking at the actual massacres that happened across Australia when the early settlers came with colonisation. And was that settlement or invasion? Another group will be looking at colonisation or invasion. What is the terminology here? What does that actually mean? What actually happened compared to what historical notes that are there from First Nations people, from settlers, from government reports. So this will give all different perspectives here. We're looking at a timeline for historical dispossession here and what happened throughout the stages. And we're also going to be looking at self-determination. What is that? Is helping strengthen the determination First Nations peoples around this historical work. So let me set up, I will put these activities into the chat for us. So we're going to have 6 groups here. And you'll notice here that I've separated them out. Group 1, you'll be looking at the invasion and the nations that were here before invasion and some of the languages that have been catalogued through the museum. Group 2, looking at slavery and what happened. Group 3, we're looking at the massacre of Aboriginal peoples. Group 4, looking at is it colonisation or invasion? And group 5, when we come to now the first 4 groups will use that link that I put in from Creative Spirits. And when you open up that, you'll see the different areas that you'll be looking for. Group 5 are going to be using this link here on timeline of dispossession. And group 6 will also be using a different link for self-determination. So let me go and create these groups. And I'm just going to... so welcome everybody back from the breakout rooms. Could I have someone from room 1, that was Abby Rose, Renee and Sabella, to talk about some of the number of nations that you discovered, maybe something about the languages that you found?
Hi. So there's only an estimated number of Aboriginal nations that are noted prior to invasion. We will never know how many truly existed. I actually misinterpreted the rest of the question. You were asking actual languages as in the First Nations languages, not like English languages used.
Yeah, that's all right. That's okay. So,
Like mobs, tribes, clans, family members, as in the language that was used around the invasion,
yes.
however, not actual Aboriginal Indigenous languages.
Okay, yep, no worries. So did you have a rough estimate of how many nations?
Between 500 and 600.
Okay. And did it say anything about, is that what they're using that now at the moment to determine a general understanding of where the nations are placed in Australia?
So I believe we came across an article that said there was around 250 to this day,
Okay.
no longer as many as they were post
Yeah.
invasion.
Yeah, and some of the languages are actually crossing over to
Mm.
sectors, and sometimes you'll find a whole state or half of a state is aware of using, say, Yugambeh language, but they also then speak their own tongue in certain groups as well, in certain nation areas, but they'll often use the two, so there's more communication happening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Room room two. We're looking at about Aboriginal slavery and what happened in Australia during that time. That was Jess, Kim, and Mahalia.
Our group. What we found was it said between the 1860s and 1970s that all ages were taken from their homes, so all people of all ages, to work on cattle and sheep farms all over Australia. It said that there were several schemes that were run by the colonial and state governments to help protect Aboriginal Australians from mistreatment, but obviously mistreatment was rife. The Queensland Government files and personal reports show between 1880s, there was at least 40 hours. They were at least working over 40 hours that they don't exactly know, but they said roughly around 40 hours per week. There was no limits on how hard the labour was or how bad their treatment was or the provision of food and living quarters. So yeah, that's pretty much what we got from reading most of that.
So not much to do around income of what they would have been given or having rights to or anything like that at all.
No, I think I've studied a bit of this previously before, and there's so many different stories. Like some people were treated, well, probably a little bit kinder than others. So some were, given food and things like that, and some were basically nearly starved but still had to do the slave labor and were treated very unfairly. So I think because there's so many different stories, some were lucky enough to be in homes where they were actually still had a roof over their head. Some had to stay outside in barns. And so I think there's so many different stories, which is why their reports are so sort of broadened. There's not an exact answer to that. But yeah,
it's a stark realization, though, that happened in this country, isn't it?
Yeah, it's horrible.
When we look at our state of our living now, what we're afforded here. Yes, and you're only talking back to the 1800s there, so it's not that long ago.
No, and this went on for quite a long time. So it just started back then, but it still went for a long, long time, which is scary to know. It was really only, not a few years, but you go back.
It goes to the point where First Nations people weren't classed as people, they were classed as flora and fauna.
Yeah, fauna, yes.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Right, group 3, which was Heidi and James, you were looking at the massacres of First Nations peoples, historical information there. Can you tell me give me an overview of what you discovered?
When it talks about like obviously saying what happened in the early settlers, the information we got was like a large number of Indigenous people, they died from starvation, so malnourishment. Obviously the survivors suffered from trauma. And then many of their like sacred sites were destroyed. Men and women were taken from their homes and then obviously forced to work as slaves as well. So and obviously it talks about a settlement or invasion as well in like that's still a debate to this day. But obviously, as an Aboriginal person, obviously living back then, they were here for 65,000 years before they got invaded. So obviously, to
Mm.
them, that was their land, you know. And then obviously when the first fleet arrived, they didn't know that anybody was here on Australia. But
Mm.
then obviously coming in, they've just taken over. So the big debate whether one person believes one thing, and then obviously Aboriginals going through what they went through is
Yeah.
also their belief as well.
And that even brings it up to when we talk about the invasion, when we talk about Australia Day, January 26th, it was traditionally started, January 26th was about Invasion Day. And First Nations people started that. That wasn't about celebrating Australia Day. It was about Invasion Day.
Yep.
And where it's evolved to what it is now is a very different perspective here with many people.
100%.
Thank you.
Right.
Room 4, Joan and Mel. Was Australia colonised or invaded? What information did you find?
Well, it's very interesting. Like, say for me, like I'm in my 60s. So when I was a kid growing up, going through school and everything, there was not even a hint that there was anything wrong with how
No.
we uh, came to Australia and colonised. It was a colonisation. That was all we knew. And I think probably a lot of things have happened since then. Like, I think it's a progress. Like, because it is obviously a big trauma and it's going through the stages of healing, I guess. But I think that with the internet has really opened up the room for debate, where you're not just in a classroom hearing what you're told happened. You actually, everyone's able to access all the information they want. And I think that's really helped a lot. So basically, it was like if you're an Aboriginal, it was invasion. If you weren't and didn't have links anywhere, it was colonisation. But now more history comes out. It's saying that Captain Cook actually himself called an invasion. He said that when he landed, that if they could take it over peacefully, great, wonderful. But if not, they had guns and they had more firearms, more ability to kill and to invade than the Indigenous people, and that they would invade. So, and it's actually, he used those words. So that was really mind-boggling to me. Even though it makes sense, but the fact that they called it an invasion back then, but that's not how it was publicized.
No. And
So,
that documentation actually came from ship diaries.
yeah.
So,
Isn't it?
I mean, some of this has been let out to the public, but not really discussed a lot. And others, it's just information that's sitting there. If you think to go and access it.
Yeah. And I think people do, it is a horrible thought to think that we've got it all wrong and we've believed it wrong and our history is very tainted and we've been spoon-fed what we've meant to believe, what other people believe and want us to believe. But it's good. It's really good it's coming out. And this is a part of the process of healing and hopefully getting to a place where it's acknowledged that, it was an invasion. And yes, it's been crime upon crime in my mind, against these people. And then hopefully getting to a place where that acknowledgement then starts producing healing, is what I hope. So yes, I mean, history shows that it's an invasion, that's it.
It opened you up to, like you say, historically, age-wise, for me, being in school in the 1960s, we would talk all the maps of Australia around where the agriculture was and the mining. We weren't taught about anything about groups of people or differences in our heritage, other than the British colonisation, because we're still under British rule in that sovereignty, which we still
Yes.
are today, but it's not as governed by that anymore.
More
Our own
autonomy
political
now,
system.
yeah.
Yeah. So, but still not enough education in that at all,
No.
on that side at all. Thank you very much for that. Right, room 5, Cass, Hugh, and Karen. You were looking at the dispossession, and there was a historical timeline here that you got to explore, I hope. What did you bring back from that?
A timeline.
Yeah, so what does that look like?
Quite horrific, actually. It's quite disturbing. Hugh, you were going to go through that, weren't you?
Yeah, I can, yeah. So I think that the timeline here shows that there is a definite pattern that is reoccurring here of dispossession and being forcibly moved off the land. And, you know, the facts here bear that out. And, you know, just living conditions that are leading to deaths and being denied food. And it seems to be a thing that keeps kind of cropping up in waves, perhaps waves of sentiment. And you do get the feeling that this might have been hidden perhaps from the general public, these kind of government policies that were going on. And then the timeline takes us all the way up to when the Racial Discrimination Act was passed, and Mabo and Wick, and then the lands rights, recognizing the dispossession and funding compensation. So that sort of takes us up to the present day.
But still an ongoing struggle in many senses. We've done some good work through the governments and the people's voices in Australia, but still more to be done. Thank you. Room 6, Colin and Kate. You were looking at self-determination. Was there a guideline around events that led to that self-determination and how it was strengthened?
Hi, Helen, and everyone.
Hi.
I came in a bit late, so I didn't really have a chance to. Me and Colin sort of had a talk about it. But the timeline starts from what we can see from April 1925, right through to when we've just had the voice,
Referendum,
thing that we
yep.
just had just now in 19. Yeah, that's right. It's just shows the history of how it's all come about. There's the governance and the decision making that goes on, and the process of choice that enables Indigenous communities to meet their social, cultural, and economic needs. I'm just sort of reading off of. It wasn't until 1975 that they were actually given guaranteeing it was recognised within Parliament. I don't know really what else to sort of say. The history is just shows that they've continuously been trying to be recognised as,
Yeah.
the first, who they are within our nation. And it's really quite interesting to read, actually, but I didn't have much of a chance. I've only just sort of been skimming through it when we were in the break room. So,
Look,
but it's just.
Thank you for bringing that. I encourage everybody to have a look at those links, please, a little bit further and open up your mind to some of the extra information here, besides what's in your learner guide, and do a bit of exploration yourself. Thanks, everybody, for doing that. So what we class as contact. So when British occupied Australia, they called the country Terra Nullius, meaning belonging to no one. We know that they talked about that it could have been an invasion, but nothing was entered into around occupying the land and sharing the land between white settlers and First Nations people. And excuse me, over that historical time, many have looked at the differences in what people believe in as ownership, what the original occupants have fought for, and what mainstream law has actually recognised. And as we said, it wasn't until 1975, I think Kate just brought that up, that the actual laws around that came through around Indigenous land ownership, nations lands ownership. So even the discussion on Aboriginal occupation, when they talk about when the first peoples here on this land, they're talking 65,000 plus years ago. And it used to be accepted that we used to be a modern settlement, but only because of when white settlement came here. So increasingly more with archaeological sites being found, especially in Northern Australia, some of the earliest pieces that they're finding now, they can date back to 67,000 years. And these are small artifacts that they're finding. So there's also a resource here I can give you to put in your, you can use this for your assessments as well. Oh, hang on, that's wrong. Get rid of that. I'll just copy and paste this in for you. I'll get rid of this other information. Just bring that up. Where is it? Here we are. Nope, she's gone. Sorry, I've lost it. I'll go back to it. Here it is. Sorry, that just ignore what that came through on the chat. And this is about the Aboriginal culture, how old that culture is, and there's some really good data information there. So let's have a look at citizenship. How did that come about? So in 1967, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like others who were born in Australia, became Australian citizens. But that was 1967. Earlier on in 1946, citizenship was brought up, but many people didn't have the same rights. They didn't have full rights until 1967. And there wasn't the right to vote, especially they separated genders around voting as well. The right to have social security in Australia, financial support, were not applicable to many people in Australia because they couldn't prove their birth. They couldn't prove their culture. And many still became displaced and not be able to be registered because they were not classed as citizens because they could not give a definitive date, time, date of birth, where they were born. If you were born out on country, you were born out on country. What's the day, the time? None of that happened many years ago. So there was a woman called Faith Bandler, excuse me, who was an activist around culture. And in 1967, she brought up a referendum that was created to help people have rights to nations. And she fought in many different ways to bring up a voice. Okay, so let's have a look at Indigenous mental health. How does all of this affect people's mental health? How does this change for people? How does this affect people, their right to support? How is their sense of belonging affected? If cultural identity was taken away, how is maintaining that positivity coming back into relationships for different cultural groups? And poor mental health can be affected by many major stresses here, but the family removal, that intergenerational trauma that's coming through, discrimination, remote living, and all the challenges that that brings. And they call it the legacies of colonization, the ongoing trauma experienced by First Nations people, how that dispossession and forced removal goes on building against emotional well-being. Stories passed down, traumas passed down, experiences passed down. That affects all the domains of well-being. It affects family, it affects kinship, communities, and the context of their own social well-being, and what does that mean? And being able to bring factors in that connect mind to emotions, to land and culture are about education, agency, and building strong identities here. So mental illness, we can look at cognitive impairments and disabilities and traumas and racism here. And often all of these affect people with their connection to their emotions because they're barriers that come in on top of normal life stresses. You, as workers out in the field, as mental health workers, when you're identifying and working with First Nations people, look at understanding the weakened spirit and the dispossession of disconnection to community or the loss of language and assimilating into what general population is doing. A lot of people have left culture behind and they can have a sense of loss. How do we support that? How do we help them express that? How does that affect mental health conditions? Think about depression. If that wasn't there as a background thing, what sort of things would then be having less effect upon that person? So these are considerations that we walk with because First Nations people are more likely to identify and be diagnosed with a very high psychological distress and feelings of control over their own life are low. And many people perceive that being diagnosed with a mental health condition can make them feel very disorientated and disenfranchised from their own peoples. So think about how you walk with that, how you try and build some understanding. And often it's about the way we can work with open-ended questions and ask these questions, finding out a little bit more. Can I ask you about this? Can you tell me a little bit more what that has been like for your family so I can have a better understanding? Because the more you can understand, the more you can walk with openness. Because this is about diversity and bringing in as much information you can when you're working with First Nations people and mental health. And that will also go across to different cultures because there's different cultural beliefs in what mental health is and how you live with that in your communities. These would be very good skills to have to walk with a broader understanding. So let's have a look at this. I'm just going to press pause. Thoughts?
I love how they talked about the spirituality aspect and that my view on the world would be different to the person sitting across the table from me, right? Whether it be you're born here or you're from overseas or you've integrated into society today, from wherever you've come from, it's really important to keep that objective view that it may be a clinical stance that I'm taking, but their cultural background doesn't allow them or doesn't allow me to see their behavior as something that would be normal to someone like myself or anybody else in my position.
Not having a fixed view, having that open view and they're not saying for you to take your view away. They're saying open it up and think about a whole different context, which we can't know, but we can try to listen. Because we won't know what it's like for somebody else, because we can talk about walking in their shoes or trying to find out what it's like, but we really don't know what it's like for somebody else. This is where questions work well, but respectful questions as well. And often people mightn't be willing to share until they feel a little bit more in a trusting space as well. But for you to not have a fixed view of walking in, like you saw what that doctor was talking about, that professor had a fixed view. He was already set. There was no changing that. So somebody would have been put into the mental health system without any recourse to say, no, this is actually what really happened for my family. And it's hard to see that people are so closed off. And this is where the new people coming through, you, all of you, walking with more openness, more wonder about things. Thanks, Abby. Jess?
I was going to say something a bit similar about how we're so diverse now throughout our countries and towns and wherever we live, that if we are working with someone from another country or have, different religion or whatever it may be, that we need to, if we want to build rapport with these people, whether it be a client or a friend or staff member, you need to be more open and willing to maybe learn a little bit more about where they've come from, so you can have that mutual respect for each other when you are having conversations, in whether it's personal or professional. I think now the world is so diverse, we shouldn't be so closed off. Anyway, I feel.
And for us to be able to help anybody that we're working with, to feel welcome into a space, to feel safe, having that openness, to willing to explore things, but also too, what the professor talked about is go and explore and find out some information as well. So then you might at least know some of the dialogue that's coming up from a discussion that you can connect some sort of research to to be able to open to it and have a bit more understanding. We will never know what it's really like for somebody else, but we can be there and hold the space to have that discussion. And when somebody's listened to with intent, that's where real story can come through, like that poor young girl that was not listened to with intent and then diagnosed and put somewhere, and that still happens. So you, as a voice, as an advocate for somebody, if you've been case managing with somebody and you found that treatment was not fair in the mental health system, being able to help that person have a voice to say what they want and to put what's really going on for them, that's an important part that you could play. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that recording? And I ask, how will you use that knowledge that you've just seen in that recording? How will that affect you and your practice in the future? Think about what knowledge you could take from that. What sort of things could you do to include into how you work with someone? Well, let me start you off in that walking with openness, wonder, be inquisitive, and be ready to listen to anything and not judge. And take notes on things that you get told around cultural stories and beliefs. They're all part of, but that makes up that person's structure of what you're working with. It helps build a bigger picture for you. So you might be able to support with more resources as well. Okay, it's 7:20. Let's go for a 20-minute break and we'll come back and then keep on working through. Welcome back, everyone. So let's start to talk about a stolen generation. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that there's lots of stories that have happened historically for many people. And for those who came from the colonization, as well as First Nations peoples. So it's something that we can broaden our understanding for all people here, because everybody would have had a different experience as well. But as we're talking about First Nations people, that stolen generation, and this also happened across other cultural groups in Australia in historical times as well. But in the context of First Nations stolen generations, between roughly 1890, this is where they've got the most facts for, 1890 and 1970, how many tens of thousands of children were taken away from families. They used to drive in their black cars, welfare officers as they called them, or they'd also bring the police with them. And people would scatter knowing what they're coming for, and gathering up small children, especially those who might have had a lighter coloured skin tone, and often once taken could not be put back together with families, unable to trace back where they had been taken or where they'd been moved to. Now, one of the best ways that we might be able to tell that story and that understanding, because there's lots of rich information that you can research on this, definitely do that. And I'm going to give you a link here. And I'm going to put it up here on the panel here for those who are watching at home. Have a look at this website and around stolen generations. Very good for your resources for your assessments as well. But one way that I was advised by a cultural elder, Auntie Pam, from the Yugambeh families in southeast Queensland, was to tell by song. And Archie Roach, a famous First Nations singer, has a song about being stolen from his family and being brought back together. But through song, he can tell his historical experiences. So let's have a listen. For those learners who are going to watch this recording, make sure you look for the link in your email that comes out for Archie Roach, or have a look for him on YouTube. You took the children away. You can also look for the lyrics to this, and it will actually give you insight into around that stolen generation. So those lyrics have very powerful meanings. And I think it's one of the best ways to communicate, to understand how it is for certain First Nations peoples. Just on that, we're watching that. Does anybody want to say anything about that song from Uncle Archie Roach?
Just for me as a mother, it's just heartbreaking, you know, sort of putting yourself in that situation where your children are taken from you, not knowing where they are, I just can't comprehend it. I don't suppose you even have to be a mother to think that way, but it definitely impacts, doesn't it?
9 children in his family, but they all came back together.
Crazy, isn't it?
They
Not
all
all
found
of
their
them were
way.
that lucky though, were they?
But I hope this gives you an insight if we're working with people and they talk about that this can help you understand that loss of time for them.
Mm.
And even though you can find their way back, there's still a gap. It's how we work with trauma. So when you're working with trauma-informed practice here for anybody, there's a gap of time that has affected that person, no matter who you're working with around that. And there's a gap of time that it's hard for them to relate to or hard to express. So lots of different people go through different traumas as well. So similar practice here, but walking with openness, it might be silence as well. There might be not a lot of talking here, because the silence speaks for itself in that space that you're with that person. Eventually, discussion might happen. And I'm talking about a trauma-informed practice here for all. That is part of what my work is in the field with telehealth, with working with people from the Gippslands who went through the fires and the floods recently, from the 2021s to the 23s. So, and trauma-informed practice, it's not about just that recent crisis. It's about other crises that has happened in people's lives as well. And that builds up that impact of what's happened. So if you're talking about the stolen generation, that was one huge impact. They've still had more impacts on top of each other as time went by. And that's how we can learn. But I think that was the best way for me to help you understand what I understand from talking to Auntie Pam, an Indigenous elder, because you can read a lot and you can take from it what you can, but to hear direct voice tell you, that's what's more important. And when it comes from direct voice, as they call it, it comes straight from that person who's been in that experience. And if you ever work and learn about a trauma-informed practice, it's about hearing their voice in all different ways.
What does trauma-informed practice mean?
Excuse me, sorry. It's a framework where understanding that barrier upon barrier has happened to somebody, and these traumatic events have caused so much disruption in emotional regulation, behaviors, responses, and people live with many different mental illness disorders from that.
Mm.
So walking with trauma-informed practice is opening up to knowing that all these things can be happening, but it's still normalized. And it's having an awareness that trauma can have this effect on people's physical as well as mental health. And having an understanding that the psychosocial wheel of wellness, which is psychosocial, is your social, emotional, and physical wellness in the environment that you live in, can all be affected because of trauma. So this is like secondary and third things that have happened to people. On top of that, they still might be walking with diabetes, might have homelessness. There's another layers of trauma that are happening.
Mm.
And the trauma changes the behaviors and responses of people. And this is where we need to be more open if we're walking with a trauma-informed framework, that we're more broad in our thinking and inclusive practice as well. So your person-centered approach is your agency that you're building, but it's all around the listening with intent, holding the space, the comment, I hear you, means a lot to validate somebody's feelings and experiences. And when you validate somebody's experiences, for them, that means I've been heard. It's real. Because many people will tell their story and they won't be heard. A lot of people have a judgment about that. Well, that couldn't have happened that way. How do we know that? So this is where being open to that. Don't forget, we still have our own understandings. That still sits to the side. But trauma-informed practice is to be open and aware of how different things affect people individually. Then when you look at society, how trauma impacts society, that is a whole nother level of impact, like the floods. Our North Queenslanders and Northern Territorians who have been through these floods recently in the last 6 to 12 months, moved out of places for safety, but taken back to makeshift places. Can I just ask everybody to turn their mics off, please? There's some TV in the background somewhere. Thank you. Mahalia?
Sorry, that's TV playing in my background. Sorry. Yeah, like when you're talking about even like with the floods and stuff, like up in where I live up near Byron Bay, and all the floods over in Lismore.
Yep.
So like I live half an hour from Lismore, and it's still so many people are, you know, still suffering. I went to Lismore today, and there's still people living in the front of their houses in caravans because
Yep.
the houses are still not, you know, livable, and they have no walls in their house, and they're still suffering, and they can't find appropriate accommodation for that. You know, there's still a lot of trauma around that even.
It is, and that will still go on because the town's still rebuilding itself right out to Bangalow and everything around there. I know the area well, and
yeah, like I live in Kyogle, and even Kyogle, there's a lot of people at the lower end of the low flooding area. Like we went through the floods in 2017 even, and the house my mum lived in, like that flooded. You know, and then the 2022 floods completely destroyed the house. That, you know, they're now destroying those houses and demolishing them because it's just
again, yeah, and that dispossession. So here's an opening to understanding what dispossession means, to isolation, to then be having something, your whole structure taken away from you and having to rebuild.
Yeah.
And even though community is pulling together down there fantastically, it doesn't get the houses built quicker. They're talking about moving the whole town further up the hill of Lismore for a start and changing things. But it's the same's happened down on the flats with Ballina as well. It's ongoing. So you can see in this instance, it's systemic because one thing affects something else. This is what intergenerational trauma is about. This is what trauma-informed practice is about. Systemic things happening on top of each other.
You can see the like even just the massive effect it's had on people's mental health. Like mental health services here are just so overwhelmed now that you know they're struggling to cope with how to deal with it. So
exactly, yes. So then how do you work and have a voice in mental health out in the field when you're walking with it? You'll have some in-depth knowledge to back you up to go, I hear you. And that's from lived experience, but it's also about listening to what other people have been through. Thank you, Mahalia, for sharing.
No worries.
So when people talk about missions, these were usually church or religious or state government run institutions as well. Some of the missions, the people who worked there were very supportive and others were not. And many children were brutalized, but that also has happened in mainstream society as well, with children being in institutions. And often, as we saw in the video clip with Archie Roach, where he got adopted by a Western family and given education and things like that, but the cultural understanding and background was not there. And they never know the exact numbers of how many children were actually taken. But they're very aware that this impact that they're talking about is anywhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3 children were taken from families, and not one First Nations community has not been forever changed from that. Every community was affected. So then they started to talk about bringing them home in 1995 to 1997. And that was a human rights, excuse me, That was a Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission that they brought in a national inquiry, and they interviewed over 500 people, and the commission's findings were published in the Bringing Them Home report. You can get that on the government website if you just Google Bringing Them Home report, and it detailed the laws and the policies and practices of how in those times that the children were able to be taken from those families, the policies that welfare and the government welfare workers and the police, the power that they had, that they used and manipulated to do what they thought was around cleansing. And they thought it was the removal of those children in their own interests. And the key recommendations from that Bringing Home report was that the apology came for the forcible removal, which then started that whole apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that were taken over these times. Thus, the government then standing up and giving recognition to what past governments and welfare agencies had deemed as important to do. So ramifications from that, people trying to remedy some of that, but it can never be remedied fully. Now, this will be a link in your resources that come out. This documentary is around the stolen generations and the freedom of rights. It's 32 minutes. Please do have a look at it. It really tells the story from those who lived through that time. So, like I said, hear voice. That is the most knowledgeable information that you can have. So, this is from Barbara Cummings and part of the Stolen Generation. It was a presumption for many years that we girls would grow up and marry nice white boys. We would have nice, fairer children who, if they were girls, would marry white boys again, and eventually the colour would die out. That was the original plan. The whole removal policy was based on the women because the women could breed. Now, that comes from the AIAT-SIS government website around historical record keeping, that they found these diaries were kept of the reasons why they were doing and taking the children. And there were many different reasons, but these were one of the main ones. Quite confronting when you see that. And the effects now in today's society of that is that insecurity of place and belonging, the lack of self-esteem, the worthlessness that has happened for many people, because these things are layering up now with violence, alcohol and other drug use, suicide, depression is major in many nations and communities in Australia. But the intergenerational trauma that's come through from family members, from the elders down through, impacts other people. So then the understanding of what loss has been, this is why it's important to reconnect with lands for many people, to gain some of that dignity back. And like you heard Paris Kneebone talk about, going back to country and putting your feet in the dirt, feeling connected again. That helps bring back self-worth. This is a West Australian video clip, a news clip on the highest teenage suicide rates in Aboriginal communities. I'll just check the time frame on that. It might be a short one. Yep. So I'll just press pause here. So fetal alcohol syndrome disorder is quite common across many different cultures as well now in Australia, not just First Nations people, but certain communities are struggling. And those numbers are now much larger than they were 5 years ago. Now, I don't know if many people know about Maralinga. And it's certainly something that was not publicised. There was small amounts of data that came out. But during the 1950s and 60s, the British used Australian land to test nuclear weapons on Anangu country, which caused fatal consequences. And it contaminated the lands. And it also exposed people to radiation. And it was about the black mist that hit across the lands between 1955 and 1963. And they allowed the British to perform 7 series of atomic testing on that land. And many people were forcibly removed from their traditional lands in the lead up to the test, but not all. That's where tradition and lifestyle was damaged, and the radiological psychosocial effects of that, the negativity, the conditions that it caused on the families, and the loss of traditions over that period of time. Many people were seen fleeing because they didn't warn everybody. They put up signs, which I'm going to show you what these signs look like, which really tell you nothing. That atomic testing was in the area, and people were fleeing on trucks and forced to walk their way out of desert areas without waters, but being exposed all the time to this radiation. Approximately, they've only got these small amount of figures on data. Many more happened, but over 1,200 people were exposed to that radiation that they could document from their communities. And people used to ended up getting sores from it, skin rashes, hair loss, death of entire families from vomitings and fevers, causing blindness, and long-term illnesses as cancer and lung disease. And these started to come out in the 1980s. And this is when the elders started to go back to their country and lands and find out what was going on. And what happened was there was a royal commission into that testing in 1985, and they found that commission that the government at that time had ignorance and incompetence at that time to make sure that the people on the lands were well aware of it. It was inadequately patrolled to warn the people of what was happening, and their safety was not paramount at all. In 1984, the South Australian government granted the Maralinga people title to that land, but the government themselves kept control of what they call Section 400, where the immediate testing happened. So let's have a look. This is what the warning sign was that they put up. What does that say to you? Looks like fan blades to me. But that was a warning sign to let people know that that was nuclear power and radiation that was there. And people were going back and camping on their lands, not knowing what this meant. Nobody was educated on that. And part of Maralinga is part of the Woomera prohibited area. It's known as the Woomera Rocket Range. And that was actually restricted access in from 1947. And interestingly enough, Maralinga is a Yolngu name for thunder. And on your lands, how stupid we were. We didn't think anyone owned the land. And that was the Indigenous Affairs Minister in 2014, talking back over the history of that time. They thought nobody owned those lands. They just came in and let the British have their weaponry exploration on that land. They didn't do it in their own country. They came here as because we were part of that sovereignty. The warning signs were put up, but they weren't in Indigenous language. And they did not understand the crossings of lands and what culture meant in these areas and the devastation that had on the people of Maralinga. This is a map of from the Aboriginal lands of the Ananga people, and they were forcibly moved out of these districts. And part of these lands, these radiation levels were the strongest peaks coming from the atomic testing. And that is still in those areas today. I would like to share this video of how Bobby Brown went back to his lands after the nuclear testing, but also of his experience of being there at the time of the testing. This is about government agencies coming in, making a decision, taking over, and not doing the work to make sure that people were safe. So they once again were not counted. For our learners at home, please make sure you watch that link on Maralinga. Did anybody know about Maralinga previously? Not much was said about it. Karen?
Only from my days of midnight oil and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Beds are
beds
burning.
burning.
Yep. Now you connect those two.
You can't actually, I mean, I didn't really know what it was about then. It was just a rock band. Didn't actually know what it was talking about because we didn't learn any of the history of that.
Yeah. Although Peter Garrett was always a great demonstrator of First Nations rights and things like that, and then went on to do his political work. But if you actually go and look at the lyrics, now you've seen that clip, go and have a look at the lyrics for Midnight Oils, Beds Are Burning. Now you'll put two things together where activism was happening to fight up against that what happened. But there's another part of history we don't hear a lot about. Having that awareness for those people who lived in that area, it's around having an understanding that for South Australia, that's huge, that's happened in their state.
Was
And
that
the
the
effects,
sorry?
right?
Was that the Wimmera people?
And
Was it their land?
and the Anunga lands.
Anunga, yeah.
So, excuse me. So thoughts, please, on that. Anybody got any thoughts on that? How will you walk with more awareness after seeing that? Yes, that song is about environment and climate change, but also beds are burning, the beds that are burning for in First Nations peoples as well. It has a lot of connection to different things that happened across history.
A lot of rights were violated, human rights, basic rights were violated during that time in so many different ways.
Yep. How will that help your practice then, Abby?
Maintaining an open view when communicating with First Nations people to just hold the history in front of mind when discussing anything that they're going with and using an active trauma response. Or what is it? Trauma-informed response.
Excellent.
I realise how little I know too about all these things, you know.
Yeah.
Sort of, I'm ashamed of that, really.
And this also went on to not just affect First Nations peoples in these lands, it devastated farming lands further out as well. And the effects on the animals and the mutations in animals and it just mind-boggling in that these things happened, but the warning signs were this. That's your warning sign. How would you know not to go camping there? It's the same as there's some other towns where they did different bomb testing that the pits of water where the children swam, the water was so contaminated that those children died early, much younger than they should have. And because the water was contaminated, they would drink it until it was discovered. Then things change, but then the harm has already been done. So I just want to also add in this website here that you can go to this link and have a look around the stolen generations, and also on the mental health professional network in Australia, emerging minds and mental health professionals were speaking about this, and there's decolonisation talks and mental health, how it affects mental health. So you can have a look at, this is where families was trying to find each other and the things that they went through. And so many who were fostered out or adopted did not have paperwork to go with it. Hence, the stolen generation grew to stolen generations, because it didn't just happen one time, it happened generation after generation. And when you think about that, breaking those ties to cultural activities, to families and to beliefs, it's the same for other people who were taken and adopted away from families that couldn't care for them in other ways across the country as well. Young mothers having children and the children were taken from them because society deemed that they couldn't bring them up on their own. Somebody else needed to bring them up. They didn't have rights or choices. These are all very similar rights and choices and things that happen for many people. And this is where we call it about intersectionality, where similar things have happened, but cultural backgrounds are different, but things met in the crisis where people have experienced. Do go on and have a look at what we call the MHPN network. They have lots of podcasts and talks. You can join up for free, and they bring out talks on mental health in Australia. There's all different sectors you can belong to. There might be sectors on ADHD. There could be sectors on trauma-informed practice, and they meet once a month. They talk, but they also do podcasts that are available on there as well. You can join up for free there. It's a good resource area. And also to this website here, and looking at for you to be able to gather some of your information for your assessments as well. Okay, let me just stop share there. We're going to open up and unpack the tasks next week. So we'll spend at least the last 30, 40 minutes of the session next week unpacking the tasks, because there's role plays to do in this as well. And we'll go through that more. Are there any questions from tonight?
So probably a silly question, but as far as generational trauma goes, does it ever heal?
Good question. When you think about, let's put it in different contexts here. So has anybody had anybody that's fought in the war out of your families and generations, who could be people who went to war to fight for Australia's freedom, the Second World War? You might know of people who are in the First World War, so grandparents or great-grandparents. Grandparents that would have fought in the Second World War might have gone over to Vietnam. Different things. They might have gone to Afghanistan. And those traumas, their stories and what they're coming back with and explaining to families what happened, intrinsically affect people deeply on the inside. And that often can keep going on. How the next generation works with that and understands that concept could change that process. But the understanding that that happened to their family, that stays. How it's perceived as it comes down the line, and the storytelling and the understanding of the concept of what people went through. It's like many veterans will never tell the truth, the whole truth about what happened for them. Many people from the stolen generation will never tell you the full truth of what happened. Many young children who were taken from into missions into religious areas than that were put into foster homes. They will never tell you the full story, but they carry it with them. You can tell by their actions and their emotions, and that strong emotions is something that can be passed genetically. They're looking at neuroscience for that, of how these things can be passed down through. So it's a very complex question to ask. Does that change? I think it would be depending on what each generation does with that information. Do people want to block that out and move forward? Do people want to consider that because that's a part of the family structure? How do you honor that, but how do you live with that? Does that become a barrier to something? This is where trauma comes into it. That's a very good question, though. And I always have to say each family would be individual on that. Because you think about the different traumas now that happen for people that, due to something happening in the past, they now might have got themselves into trouble now with alcohol and other drugs or risky behaviors, which only then impact upon the trauma that came before. So then they walk with that as well as what's happening to them now. How they've got caught up in that, that's another story as well. But then that's another barrier to them moving forward and feeling the weight of that trauma. Often when they're doing that sort of behaviors to themselves, the weight of what happened before comes back and feels heavier. So that's why it has such an impact. Others use alcohol and other drugs to blot it out because they felt the grandparents' pain. It's complex. But how do we walk with that as practitioners out in the field? Understanding that it is complex, and we'll never know the full story. But like we said, being open to it, being able to understand a little bit more what it's like for somebody else, because we don't know. And this is where we can ask very respectful questions and wait for the story to come out as well. Can't force those stories out of respect. It's the same as then we might have people that we're working with that we really have to think of dignity of risk and the risk that they're taking to mask some of these problems. And it's not about judging them for using drugs and alcohol. It's about how we can help educate more to go away from that. But this is about masking problems. And often a lot of us have different ways to mask problems. But it just makes things more complex if we're the workers who are assisting people who are going through that. Heavy night, everyone. Lots of heavy information. Take it, unpack it, but think about how you will utilize some of this for your skills, your practice, your framework. Your framework of practice is about what it's built on, your beliefs, your values, your ethics, but then you build it up with person-centered practice, self-determination, agency, working authentically. This is building a framework that you follow, and you house it with all these systems and theories. But the basis is here around your own values and beliefs here. And that's where your platform starts from. And if you can walk with openness, inquisitiveness, as we talk about that, but being authentic, be who you are. Don't take that away from yourself. And it's not about changing your beliefs. It's just walking with others. So thanks everyone for being here tonight. And thank you for having me here. We will see you next week. You can email me and ask me questions. That's helen@hayderinstitute.edu.au if you want to ask questions.
Sorry, can you just put your email address in comments, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, because I was going to ask a question about role plays. I've had the last couple of weeks in hospital and just got out, so and I missed a couple of the sessions regarding like role plays, and so
Yep.
I need to try and work out how to catch up with a lot of them.
Okay.
That would-
You can email me that. I'm just going to press pause, stop recording, but
Oh,
don't
yep.
go away, and then I'll come back to that.